By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late. They found the tent first, and somehow, that only made the mystery worse. It was February 26, 1959. A rescue party was moving slowly through the harsh, unyielding landscape of the northern Ural Mountains. The weather up there was unforgiving. The wind howled across the open ridges, carrying sharp ice that stung the face. The air was so deeply cold it felt like breathing glass. They were looking for a group of 9 hikers who were weeks overdue from their expedition. These were not amateurs who had simply lost their way. They were 9 young, healthy, deeply experienced mountaineers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. They were strong. They were smart. They had spent years training for exactly this kind of environment. They were supposed to return home days ago, but they had simply vanished into the endless white snow. The searchers pushed forward, eventually reaching the lonely slope of a mountain that the indigenous Mansi people called Kholat Syakhl. Translated into English, the name carries a heavy warning. It means dead mountain. That is where the search party saw it. A single canvas tent, half buried under the heavy winter snow. The men called out, but it was completely silent. There was no smoke rising from a morning fire. There were no voices answering back from the frozen ridge. There was just the steady, hollow sound of the freezing wind moving across the empty landscape. When the searchers approached, they held on to a small shred of hope. They expected to find the hikers sheltering inside, perhaps sick or waiting out a terrible storm. Or, failing that, they expected to find the tragic but predictable end to a mountaineering accident, a group who had slowly frozen in their sleep. But what they found made absolutely no sense. The tent was partially collapsed. It was weighed down by snow, but it was not entirely crushed by an avalanche. When the searchers brushed away the white powder and looked closer, they saw that the heavy canvas was torn. But the long tears did not come from the fierce mountain wind. They did not come from a wild animal trying to claw its way inside. The investigators would later confirm an impossible detail. The tent had been cut open from the inside out. Someone had taken a knife and frantically slashed their way through the thick fabric. They did not even bother to use the front entrance. They cut their way out of the side of the tent and pushed through the gap. When the search party finally looked inside the dark shelter, the confusion only deepened into a cold, sinking dread. Everything the hikers needed to survive was still in there. Their thick, heavy coats, their insulated winter boots, their woolen blankets, their rations, their axes. All of it was neatly arranged, waiting for them. Outside the tent, the temperature that night had dropped to almost -20 degrees Fahrenheit. That is almost -30 degrees Celsius. Stepping into that kind of extreme cold without proper clothing is a rapid death sentence. These hikers knew that. They were certified Grade 2 hikers, about to earn their Grade 3 certification. That was the highest level of mountaineering expertise available in the Soviet Union at the time. They knew the mountains better than almost anyone. They knew exactly what happens to a human body when it is exposed to the freezing night air. They knew that leaving their gear behind meant they were going to die. Yet they left their coats. They left their boots. The searchers looked down at the surrounding snow. The harsh wind had not completely erased the tracks of the night they vanished. Leading away from the ruined tent, moving down the steep slope toward the edge of a dark, distant forest, were footprints. 8 or 9 distinct sets of tracks. The searchers followed them. As they stared down at the impressions in the ice, a deep sense of unease settled over the group. The footprints were not made by heavy winter boots. Some of the tracks clearly showed the shape of people wearing nothing but thin socks. A few tracks showed someone wearing only a single shoe. And some tracks were made by completely bare feet. Bare feet, sinking into the freezing snow in the middle of a pitch-black winter night on Dead Mountain. If they were running from something terrifying, the tracks did not show it. That was the most unsettling part. The footprints were not chaotic. They were not scattered in a blind panic. The stride was entirely normal. It looked as though the 9 experienced hikers had walked calmly, side by side, away from the only shelter that could keep them alive. They walked down the mountain, into the dark tree line, towards a frozen valley where there was no warmth and no hope. Why would 9 rational, highly intelligent people cut their way out of their own tent, leave all their life-saving gear behind, and walk barefoot into a deadly winter storm? It is a question that has haunted the world for over 6 decades. The search party followed the barefoot tracks for about a mile. The trail eventually disappeared under the shifting snow near the edge of the dense woods. There, beneath a large, ancient cedar tree at the edge of the forest, they found the very first signs of what happened after the hikers left the tent. They found the dark remains of a small, desperately built fire. The thick branches of the cedar tree had been snapped off. Some were broken as high as 15 feet off the ground. This meant someone had climbed the tree with freezing hands, either to gather dry wood or to look back up the dark slope, to look back at the tent, or perhaps to look at whatever it was that drove them out of it. Next to the dead ashes of the fire were 2 bodies. They were 2 of the young men from the group. They were lying flat in the snow. They were wearing nothing but their underwear. No coats, no boots, no gloves. Their skin was discolored, and their hands and feet were severely damaged by the unimaginable cold. This discovery alone was enough to send a chill through the Soviet authorities. It was a senseless, bizarre tragedy, but it was still just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, and then months, the rest of the missing hikers would finally be found, and with every body that was pulled from the snow, the story became darker. It became stranger. It became something that science, logic, and human reasoning struggled to explain. Some of them were found wearing odd pieces of clothing that had been ripped from the bodies of their friends. Some of them had massive internal injuries that a medical examiner later compared to the devastating impact of a high-speed car crash. Yet there were absolutely no signs of a struggle. No signs of another person on the mountain. No signs of a wild animal attack. Just shattered bones beneath unbruised skin. The Soviet government would eventually close the case in quiet frustration, blaming the deaths on an unknown compelling force. A phrase that means absolutely nothing. A phrase designed to shut down questions and close the files. But the questions never stopped. The incident at Dyatlov Pass has become one of the most enduring, deeply unsettling mysteries of the modern age. It is a story with 100 different theories. Secret military weapons tests, unexplainable acoustic phenomena, violent encounters, rogue avalanche events, and things far more unbelievable. But none of the theories ever seem to fit all the pieces. There is always one detail that refuses to make sense. One piece of evidence that contradicts the rest. One photograph that makes you wonder what they were really looking at in the dark. To understand what might have happened that night on Dead Mountain, you have to look at the people who were there. You have to look at the final photographs they took, the optimistic journals they wrote, the careful, meticulous way they planned an expedition that was supposed to be a triumph. In the beginning, it looked like an ordinary journey. They were young. They were smiling. They were taking trains and buses deep into the snowy wilderness, singing songs and taking pictures out the windows. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly into a nightmare. But that is usually how the worst stories begin. To fully grasp the horror of what happened on Dead Mountain, you have to wipe away the image of the slashed tent. You have to forget the freezing wind and the bare footprints in the snow. You have to go back to the days before the cold took over. You have to go back to January 23, 1959. The city of Sverdlovsk was covered in winter snow, but the mood among the group was anything but cold. It was electric. They were standing at the train station, packing their heavy canvas backpacks, tying their wooden skis together, and laughing. There were originally 10 of them. 8 men and 2 women. They were mostly in their early 20s, students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. They were studying engineering, physics, and economics. They were the bright, capable future of the Soviet Union. And they were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. Igor was not a casual hiker. He was highly respected among his peers. He had a reputation for being strict, deeply analytical, and entirely focused on safety. He had designed some of the group's equipment himself, including the portable stove they carried to heat the tent. People trusted Igor. Parents trusted him with their children. When Igor Dyatlov planned a route, everyone knew it'd be difficult, but they also knew he would bring them home. This trip was meant to be the ultimate test of their skills. They were aiming for a Grade 3 hiking certification. At the time, that was the highest and most difficult classification a civilian could achieve in the Soviet Union. It required a group to traverse over 190 miles of rugged, freezing terrain on foot and skis. Their goal was a mountain located in the extreme northern edge of the Ural mountain range. The mountain was called Otorten. It is a haunting detail of history that, depending on who you ask, the local indigenous Mansi people translate the name Otorten to mean, "do not go there." But the hikers were not afraid of old local legends. They were young, strong, and fueled by the optimism of their age. They had maps. They had compasses. They had an incredible amount of shared experience. They believed in science, preparation, and each other. Most of the group was young, but they were joined by a man named Semyon Zolotaryov. Semyon was 38 years old. He was a veteran of the Second World War. He had survived some of the most brutal combat in human history. He was tough, experienced, and deeply practical. He joined the group to earn his own master certification. The fact that a hardened combat veteran was among them only makes the final outcome more disturbing. Whatever happened on that mountain was terrifying enough to overpower even a man who had survived the absolute horrors of war. The first few days of their journey were documented in their personal diaries. They also brought several cameras, snapping roll after roll of black and white film. Those photographs survived. They were later developed by the investigators, and they are absolutely heartbreaking to look at today. The pictures show a group of friends having the time of their lives. You can see them sitting together on crowded train cars, playing a mandolin, and smiling widely at the camera. You can see them posing in the deep snow, playfully pretending to struggle with their heavy backpacks. You can see the deep bonds of friendship in the way they looked at each other. They were a family forged by the harsh Russian winters. Looking at these photos now feels like looking at ghosts. They capture a beautiful, fleeting moment of innocence right before the absolute unknown swallowed them whole. They spent the first few days traveling by train and bus, moving further and further away from modern civilization. The buildings grew smaller. The roads disappeared. The forests grew thicker and darker. By January 25th, they arrived in a small, isolated logging settlement called Vizhai. This was the absolute end of the line. It was the last inhabited outpost before the endless, frozen wilderness of the northern Urals began. This is where the story of the 10 hikers becomes the story of the 9. One of the men in the group was named Yuri Yudin. Shortly after they arrived in the logging settlement, Yuri began to experience severe, crippling pain in his back and joints. It was an old ailment flaring up in the worst possible conditions. The pain was so intense that he could barely walk, let alone ski for hundreds of miles carrying heavy gear. Yuri was devastated. He wanted to push through the pain. He wanted to stay with his friends. But Igor Dyatlov, ever the responsible leader, made the final call. Yuri had to turn back. It was far too dangerous to take a sick man into the deep freeze. On January 28th, the group stood together in the freezing morning air to say goodbye. They hugged Yuri. They gave him a few extra items they would not need. They joked with him, telling him not to feel too bad about missing out on the difficult climb. Before he left, Igor Dyatlov made a promise to Yuri. He told him that the expedition would take a little longer than originally planned. He promised that as soon as the group returned to the settlement of Vizhai, he would send a telegram to the sports club back home to let everyone know they were safe. Igor expected to send that message around February 12th. Yuri nodded, hugged his friends one last time, and climbed into a cart to begin his long journey back to the city. He turned around and watched the 9 hikers strap on their wooden skis. He watched them adjust their heavy packs. And he watched them glide away into the dense, snow-covered forest, laughing and talking as they disappeared into the white horizon. Yuri Yudin lived to be 75 years old. He spent the rest of his long life wondering why fate had spared him, and what really happened to his friends after he turned his back. He gave countless interviews over the decades, and in every single one, his voice was heavy with survivor's guilt. He was the last person to ever see them alive. After leaving the settlement, the 9 hikers were entirely alone. There were no radios. There were no rescue teams waiting on standby. There was only the map, the compass, and the vast, silent wilderness. For the first few days on the trail, everything went exactly according to plan. We know this because of the journals they left behind. Their entries described the physical exhaustion of breaking a trail through the deep snow, but they also described the quiet beauty of the frozen rivers and the deep, silent woods. They wrote about sitting around the campfire at night, eating warm food, and debating science and love under the winter stars. They were making good time. The weather was harsh, but manageable. They were following the frozen riverbeds, using the valleys to shield themselves from the brutal mountain winds. But as January drew to a close, the landscape began to change. The protective tree line began to thin out. The deep valleys slowly gave way to steep, rising slopes. The wind started to pick up, carrying a sharp, bitter edge that cut through their heavy clothing. They were leaving the safety of the forest and stepping onto the exposed, unforgiving slopes of the mountains. They were getting closer to Otorten. They were getting closer to the place they were warned not to go, and deep in the quiet pages of their final journal entries, the tone began to subtly shift. The jokes became less frequent. The descriptions of the cold became more severe. They did not know it yet, but they were walking precisely into the trap of Dead Mountain, and the timeline of their survival was now measured in hours. The northern Ural Mountains do not feel like a place meant for human beings. They are incredibly old. The peaks are not sharp and jagged like the Rockies. They are smooth, worn down by millions of years of brutal wind and ice. But that smoothness is deceptive, because there are no sharp peaks to break the wind. The storms gather an unstoppable momentum. They roll across the frozen ridges like a freight train. By January 31st, the 9 hikers were feeling the heavy, physical toll of the environment. They had spent days breaking a trail through the deep, virgin snow of the Ospaya River Valley. The dense forest had protected them from the worst of the winter weather, but as they climbed higher, the trees began to thin out. The protective canopy vanished. They were approaching the edge of the highlands, the final open stretch before their ultimate destination. But the mountain was waiting for them. When they tried to push above the tree line on the afternoon of January 31st, they were hit by a fierce, screaming headwind. It was so strong that they could barely stand upright on their skis. The blowing snow raised the horizon, turning the world into a disorienting, blinding white wall. They realized it was impossible to continue that day. Igor Dyatlov made the smart, safe choice. He ordered the group to fall back. They retreated down the slope, back into the safety of the forest, and set up camp to wait out the worst of the weather. They knew the final push to the summit of Orton was going to be the hardest part of the entire expedition. They needed to travel light. So, on the morning of February 1st, they built what Russian hikers call a labaz. It is a temporary cache, hidden in the snow. They took out their surplus food, their extra heavy gear, and even the mandolin that had brought them so much joy on the train rides. They buried it all carefully in the woods. They marked the spot so they could find it on their way back down. They were stripping away everything that was not absolutely necessary for survival. They planned to carry only enough food and gear for a quick, rapid ascent over the pass. At around 3 o'clock in the afternoon on February 1st, they left the safety of the tree line for the very last time. The weather had not improved. If anything, it was getting worse. The temperature was dropping fast. A heavy, continuous snow began to fall, swirling wildly in the bitter wind. Visibility was reduced to almost nothing. They were navigating blindly through a freezing whiteout. As they moved through the mountain pass, the blinding snow caused them to drift slightly off their intended course. They were supposed to go straight through the pass. Instead, they drifted to the west. They began to slowly climb the eastern shoulder of the mountain known as Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain. By the time they realized they had veered off course, it was getting late. The weak winter sun was starting to set. The temperature was plunging toward -20 degrees Fahrenheit. They had a massive, critical decision to make. They were standing on an exposed slope with an incline of about 20 degrees. The wind was hitting them from all sides. About 1.5 miles down the mountain, right behind them, was the thick forest they had just left. The trees offered shelter. The trees offered dry wood for a roaring fire. Survival protocol dictated that they should ski back down to the forest, wait out the night, and try again in the morning. But they did not go back down. Instead, Igor Dyatlov decided to pitch their tent right there, exactly where they stood, on the open, freezing slope of Dead Mountain. This is the first great mystery of the Dyatlov Pass. It is a decision that has baffled seasoned mountaineers and investigators for decades. Why did 9 highly experienced hikers choose to camp on a deadly, exposed ridge when safety was only a short ski ride away? Some experts believe Igor did not want to lose the altitude they had just spent hours fighting to gain. Going down meant they would just have to climb back up the next day. Others believe he intentionally chose the harsh location as a training exercise. He wanted the group to practice pitching a tent on a barren slope to prepare them for even harder expeditions in the future. Whatever his reason was, the group followed his lead. They did not argue. They got to work. We know exactly what they did next because they documented it. The investigators who later developed the film from the frozen cameras found one final, haunting photograph. It is dark, blurry, and hard to make out, but it shows the hikers digging a flat pit into the deep snow to protect the bottom of the tent from the wind. They are leaning heavily on their ski poles. They are working together. It is the very last time any of them were photographed alive. They set up the tent. They secured it with their skis. They crawled inside, out of the screaming wind, and sealed the heavy canvas shut behind them. 9 adults packed tightly into a tent designed for fewer people. It was incredibly cramped, but that was intentional. The tight space meant their body heat would help warm the freezing air. Because the weather was so terrible, they could not set up their portable stove without risking carbon monoxide poisoning or catching the canvas on fire. So they settled in for a bitterly cold, dark night. They took off their heavy, wet winter boots to let them dry. They took off their thick outer coats. They were wearing comfortable sweaters, long underwear, and thick socks. They unpacked their dry rations, sliced pork fat, hard crackers, and the last of the warm tea from a thermos. They were not afraid. They were not panicking. We know this because they took out a piece of paper and began writing a satirical, handwritten newspaper to entertain themselves. They called it the Evening O Torten. They wrote inside jokes about the group. They made fun of their own snoring. They wrote about their scientific debates. They were doing what friends do. They were laughing in the dark, completely unaware of what was waiting outside the thin canvas walls. For hours, the only sound was the howling of the wind and the quiet voices inside the tent. They ate their dinner. They arranged their blankets. They closed their eyes to get some sleep, and then something happened. We do not know what it sounded like. We do not know what it felt like. We only know that it was so sudden, so confusing, and so utterly terrifying that nobody had time to put their boots back on. Nobody had time to grab their heavy coats. Someone grabbed a knife. They pressed the blade against the wall of the tent, and they began to cut. Part 4, the point of no return, the blade sliced through the thick canvas. It was not a single, clean cut. The investigators later found multiple long slashes in the fabric. Someone had frantically sawed at the heavy material from the inside, desperate to make a hole large enough for a human body to squeeze through. The moment the canvas split open, the outside world violently rushed in. The temperature was dropping past -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was screaming across the open slope at hurricane speeds. Blinding snow whipped through the sudden darkness of the tent. They did not stop to grab their boots. They did not reach for their heavy winter coats. They pushed their way out of the jagged hole, stepping directly into the freezing storm, wearing only their sleeping sweaters, thin socks, and bare feet. This is the moment that defies all logic. This is the moment that turns a terrible tragedy into a terrifying mystery. If an avalanche was slowly crushing the tent, you would expect them to dig frantically, or to scatter in absolute, blinding panic. If a wild animal was tearing its way inside, you would expect them to run in every direction to survive. But the tent was not buried by an avalanche. It was barely covered by drifting snow, and the hikers did not scatter. The footprints they left behind tell a story of eerie, unsettling discipline. Despite whatever horror had driven them out of their shelter, they did not run wildly into the night. Running in the dark on a steep, icy mountain slope is a guarantee of broken legs and fatal falls. Instead, they stayed together. The tracks showed that the 9 hikers linked up. They walked side by side, or in a tight line, moving carefully down the slope. They were stepping over sharp, hidden rocks and crushing solid ice beneath their bare heels. The pain must have been immediate and agonizing, but they kept moving downward, toward the distant tree line, almost a mile and a half away. They were retreating. It took them an estimated 30 to 40 minutes to walk from the ruined tent to the edge of the forest. 30 to 40 minutes of walking through a blinding whiteout, with absolutely no protection against a wind chill that was literally freezing the moisture in their eyes and lungs. Medical science tells us exactly what happens to the human body in these extreme conditions. The blood rapidly pulls away from the hands and feet to protect the vital organs in the chest. The skin goes completely numb. The muscles begin to stiffen and fail. The cold becomes a physical, crushing weight, dragging you down into the snow. By the time they reached the edge of the dark cedar forest, they were already dying. The thick trees provided a small amount of protection from the screaming wind, but it was not enough. They were in total darkness. They could no longer see the tent up on the slope. They had no shelter. They had no coats. They stopped beneath a massive, ancient cedar tree. Its wide branches hung low to the frozen ground. This is where they made their first desperate stand against the cold. They tried to build a fire. We know they were frantic because of the damage they did to the tree. They did not just gather loose, dead branches from the snow. Someone climbed the cedar tree in the pitch-black night. They snapped off thick, green branches as high as 15 feet in the air. The investigators later found blood and human tissue embedded in the rough bark of the tree. The hikers had climbed until their freezing, numb hands literally tore open, desperately breaking off wood to feed the small flames. But a small fire in a roaring mountain blizzard is almost entirely useless. It provides a tiny circle of heat, but the violent wind immediately strips it away. They sat around the pathetic flames, huddled together in the dark. Through the broken branches of the cedar, they had a clear line of sight back up the slope. They were looking back toward the tent. Why were they watching it? Were they waiting for something to leave? Were they hoping to see a sign that it was safe to return? Or were they just watching their only chance of survival fade into the blinding snow? As the minutes dragged on, the cold began to win. 2 of the hikers, Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko, were the first to collapse. They were the ones found lying side by side next to the dead ashes of the fire when the search party arrived weeks later. They were wearing nothing but their underwear. As their 2 friends died in the snow, the remaining 7 hikers realized a horrifying truth. The fire was not going to save them. Staying under the cedar tree meant freezing to death one by one. They had to make a choice, and they had to make it immediately. The group of 7 fractured. Igor Dyatlov, the strong, responsible leader who had promised to bring them all home, made his final decision. He was not going to wait in the dark. He was going to go back for the tent. He was going to get their coats, their boots, and their gear. 2 others joined him, a young woman named Zinaida Kolmogorova and a young man named Rustam Slobodin. They turned their backs on the dying fire. They stepped out from the protection of the trees, and they began the impossible task of crawling back up the steep, icy slope, directly into the screaming wind. The remaining 4 hikers chose a different path. Semyon Zolotaryov, the hardened combat veteran, led the rest of the survivors away from the cedar tree. They did not try to climb back up the mountain. Instead, they moved deeper into the forest. They headed toward a dark, steep ravine, hoping to find a snow cave or a natural shelter that could block the wind. Before they walked into the darkness of the woods, they did something deeply unsettling. They took a knife and cut the clothing off the bodies of their 2 dead friends. They wrapped the frozen, torn rags around their own bare feet and hands. It was a brutal, desperate act of survival. The group was now split, 3 crawling blindly up the mountain, 4 walking blindly into the ravine. None of them knew that the nightmare was far from over. The mountain had already taken 2 lives. It was about to take the rest. But the violent, unexplainable way the final 4 would be found would change this tragedy from a simple freezing death into one of the darkest mysteries of the 20th century. Part 5. The first signs. The wind on the open slope was deafening. It pushed against them like a solid wall of moving ice. Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin were crawling on their hands and knees. They were trying to cover the massive, impossible distance between the cedar tree and the abandoned tent. They had no coats. They had no boots. Every time they lifted their heads, the blowing snow blinded them, stinging their faces like thousands of tiny needles. The cold was no longer just a temperature. It was a physical weight pressing down on their chests, forcing the air out of their lungs. But they kept moving. They were fighting for the survival of their friends waiting back in the dark forest. They never made it. When the military and civilian search parties arrived weeks later, in late February, they found the bodies of the 3 hikers frozen into the side of the mountain. The scene was heartbreaking. The frozen poses told a story of sheer, desperate willpower that finally gave out. Igor Dyatlov was found about 300 yards from the cedar tree. He was lying on his back, looking up at the gray winter sky. One hand was gripping the frozen branch of a small, buried birch tree, as if he had tried to pull himself up to his feet one last time. His body was stiff, locked forever in that final struggle. Rustam Slobodin had managed to crawl a little further up the slope. He was found face down in the snow, his body half buried by the drifting winds. When the medical examiners eventually looked at his body in the morgue, they found the very first hint that something was truly wrong. Rustam had a fracture on the side of his skull. It was a blunt force injury. The doctors determined it was not severe enough to kill him on its own, and they blamed it on a bad fall against a rock hidden under the snow. But it was a violent, physical trauma that did not match a simple freezing death. Zinaida Kolmogorova had made it the furthest. She was 22 years old, incredibly tough, and deeply loved by everyone at the institute. She had crawled almost 2/3 of the way back to the tent before her heart simply stopped. The search party found her face down, her body frozen in a desperate, reaching position. There was dark, frozen blood on her face from a heavy nosebleed. She had fought the mountain until the absolute last second of her life. The Soviet authorities looked at the 5 bodies they had recovered so far, the 2 young men by the dying fire, and the 3 hikers on the open slope. To the investigators, the story seemed tragic, but entirely straightforward. A group of hikers got frightened by a sudden avalanche or a brutal winter storm. They fled their tent in a blind panic. They realized their terrible mistake too late, and they froze to death trying to fix it. Hypothermia is a cruel and confusing killer. It makes the human brain do irrational things. For a brief moment, the authorities believed the case was mostly closed. 5 hikers froze to death. Tragic, but normal for the harsh Russian winter. But 4 hikers were still missing. Semyon Zolotaryov, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, and Nikolai Thibugsbrignols were nowhere to be found. March came and went. The brutal winter winds continued to bury Dead Mountain under massive, heavy drifts of snow. April passed slowly. The families of the missing hikers demanded answers. They wrote letters to the government. They begged the military to keep looking. The civilian volunteers from the institute refused to go home. They continued to probe the deep snow with long metal poles, hoping to strike something hidden in the white landscape. It was a grim, exhausting process. The optimism of a rescue mission had completely vanished. It was now simply a dark recovery operation, waiting patiently for the mountain to thaw. Finally, in the first week of May, 1959, the seasons began to change. The harsh winter sun started to melt the top layers of the heavy snow. The frozen woods began to drip with water. A Mansi hunter assisting the search party noticed something strange near the edge of the forest. It was a subtle trail of broken branches and torn pine needles, leading away from the giant cedar tree. The trail pointed down toward a steep, narrow ravine hidden deep in the dark woods. The searchers followed the trail. They began to dig into the heavy, wet snow filling the ravine. About 75 yards away from the cedar tree, buried under 10 feet of packed snow, their shovels hit something that did not belong in the wild. It was a makeshift floor. Someone had taken thick branches, small trees, and torn pieces of clothing and arranged them carefully on the ground. It was a makeshift den, a desperate, calculated attempt to build a shelter against the freezing wind. The 4 missing hikers had clearly spent time here. They had huddled together in the dark, wearing the clothes they had cut from the bodies of their dead friends. They had tried to survive. But the den was completely empty. The searchers were confused. If the hikers had spent the energy to build a shelter, why did they leave it? Where did they go? They continued to dig further down the steep slope of the ravine, moving toward a small, rocky creek that was running with freezing meltwater. The digging was slow and incredibly difficult. They pushed through layer after layer of dense, packed snow and dark mud. And then, deep in the rocky creek bed, they found them. The final 4 bodies were lying piled together in the freezing water. They were heavily decomposed after spending 3 long months buried under the heavy snow. They were the best dressed of all the hikers. They were wearing thick coats, warm hats, and the ripped trousers from the 2 men at the cedar tree. They had done exactly what they needed to do to survive the cold. Semyon, the combat veteran, was even found holding a pen and a small notepad, as if he had been trying to write something down in the dark before he died. The search party carefully pulled the bodies out of the freezing mud. They thought they had finally found the end of the tragic story. But when the bodies were sent back to the city, and the medical examiners opened them up, the entire case completely shattered. The official story was that the group had frozen to death. The Soviet authorities had been perfectly comfortable with that quiet explanation. But what the doctors found in the morgue weeks later could not be explained by the cold. It could not be explained by a winter storm. It could not be explained by an avalanche. Because these 4 hikers did not just freeze to death in the snow. Something in the dark had crushed them. And whatever it was, it left absolutely no footprints behind. The story shifts from the freezing mountain to the bright, sterile lights of a Soviet morgue. The date was May 9, 1959. Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny stood over the metal examination tables. He was a highly experienced medical examiner. He had seen the brutal things people do to each other. He had seen what nature does to a human body. He thought he knew exactly what to expect when the final 4 hikers were brought into his examination room. He had already performed the autopsies on Igor Dyatlov and the first 4 victims found in the snow. Those reports were tragic, but straightforward. They died of severe hypothermia. The mountain froze them. It was a heartbreaking accident, but it made logical sense. But as Dr. Vozrojdeny began to examine the final 4 bodies pulled from the dark ravine, the logic of the entire case completely fell apart. He started with Nikolai Thibuk's Brignol's. Nikolai was wearing multiple layers of clothing. He had a thick hat on his head. But when the doctor examined his skull, he found a massive, devastating fracture. The bone was cracked open in a wide pattern, driven deeply inward. It was a fatal injury. But what terrified the medical examiner was the skin on the outside of Nikolai's head. The scalp was completely intact. There was no cut. There was no deep bruising. There was no scrape from a sharp rock. Whatever struck him had enough crushing force to shatter his skull, but it did not break the skin. Then the doctor examined Semyon Zolotaryov, the combat veteran, and Ludmila Dubinina, the youngest woman on the expedition. The damage to their chests was catastrophic. Ludmila had 10 broken ribs. Semyon had 5 broken ribs. But they were not just cracked, they were shattered. The bones were pressed deeply inward, violently tearing into their internal organs. Ludmila had a massive hemorrhage in her right atrium. Dr. Vozrojdeny was shocked. He wrote in his official report that the internal injuries were equal to the effect of a high-speed automobile crash. He stated that the force required to break human ribs in that specific, devastating way was immense. It was the kind of trauma you see when a person is crushed under heavy machinery or struck by a massive shockwave. But again, there was an impossible detail. Just like Nikolai's skull, the skin on their chests was perfectly fine. There were no massive bruises. There were no signs of a brutal physical beating. There were no marks from a heavy weapon. It was as if an invisible, crushing weight had pressed down on them so evenly, and with such incredible force that their bones snapped before their skin could even bruise. The autopsy files also noted other deeply disturbing details. Details that would quickly turn Dyatlov Pass from a mountain tragedy into a global horror story. Because the bodies had been lying face down in a creek of running meltwater for 3 long months, nature had begun to take its course. The elements and the running water had washed away the soft tissue on their faces. Ludmila was found with empty eye sockets. Her tongue was completely missing. Semyon was also missing his eyes. Science tells us that running water and small scavengers will consume the softest tissues first. It is a grim, natural part of decomposition. But when the public eventually heard the rumors that a young woman was found on a mountain with her tongue missing, panic began to spread. The facts were scary enough, but the rumors made the mountain sound like a place of absolute evil. The physical injuries were terrifying, but it was the timeline of the injuries that completely destroyed the official narrative. The Soviet authorities desperately wanted to blame a natural avalanche. They wanted to say a heavy slab of snow slid down the mountain in the middle of the night, crushed the tent, and broke their bones. That would explain why they cut their way out. That would explain the panic. But medical science proved that theory was completely impossible. A human being cannot walk a mile and a half down a steep, icy mountain in the pitch black with a shattered skull. A human being cannot calmly walk in a straight line with 10 crushed ribs and a bleeding heart. The hikers were not injured when they left the tent. They walked down the mountain under their own power. That meant the catastrophic, crushing injuries happened down in the ravine, at the very edge of the dark forest. Hours after they fled the tent, they built that small den in the snow to hide from the wind. They sat together in the freezing dark. And then, something found them, or something happened to them, something strong enough to crush their chests like a car crash, without leaving a single footprint or debris field in the surrounding snow. And as if the shattered bones were not enough, the investigators made one final, unexplainable discovery in a laboratory miles away. When the authorities collected the wet, torn clothing from the final 4 bodies, they did something highly unusual. They sent the clothing to a radiological laboratory. Why would a local police force test hiking clothes for radiation? To this day, nobody knows exactly who ordered that test, or what they were expecting to find. But they found it. The equipment in the laboratory began to react. Several pieces of the clothing, specifically a brown sweater and a pair of trousers pulled from the bodies in the ravine, were contaminated. They were emitting abnormally high levels of beta radiation. The clothes were radioactive. A group of college students went hiking on a remote mountain. They abandoned their survival gear. They walked barefoot into the freezing dark. They suffered massive, crushing injuries that left no external bruises, and their clothes were stained with radiation. the local investigators were entirely overwhelmed. They were dealing with a scene that looked like a terrifying science fiction story, but it was sitting right there on their metal autopsy tables. The lead civilian investigator, a man named Lev Ivanov, began to ask very uncomfortable questions. He started looking at the sky. He started looking at the military bases scattered across the Ural Mountains. And that is exactly when the Soviet government stepped in. The doors to the investigation were about to be slammed shut. Part 7: The Investigation. Lev Ivanov was a man who believed in facts. He was the lead civilian investigator assigned to the case by the Soviet authorities. He was used to looking at terrible accidents and finding the logical sequence of mistakes that caused them. He knew how to read a crime scene. He knew how to read the frozen landscape of the Ural Mountains. But as he sat at his desk in the spring of 1959, looking at the final autopsy reports, he realized the facts no longer made any sense. He had 9 dead hikers. He had a slashed tent. He had bare footprints in the snow. He had 4 bodies with massive, crushing internal injuries that left the skin completely unbroken. And he had a laboratory report confirming that pieces of their clothing were heavily contaminated with radioactive material. Ivanov knew this was no longer a simple search and rescue operation. The mountain was holding a secret. As he struggled to piece together a rational explanation, a new wave of evidence arrived. But this evidence did not come from the deep snow of the ravine. It came from the sky. During the weeks that the hikers had been missing, rumors had begun to spread across the region. Another group of experienced hikers, who had been camping about 30 miles south of Dead Mountain on the exact same night, came forward with a deeply unsettling story. They told investigators that they had woken up in the middle of the freezing night. When they looked toward the northern horizon, in the direct path of Otorten and the Dyatlov group, they saw something impossible. Floating silently above the dark peaks were massive, glowing orange spheres. The witnesses described them as shining fireballs, moving steadily and quietly through the winter sky, and they were not the only ones who saw them. Over the next few weeks, Ivanov received similar reports from local meteorologists, independent witnesses, and even members of the military stationed in the region. Between February and March of 1959, strange, glowing orbs were repeatedly seen hanging over the northern Urals. For Lev Ivanov, this was the missing piece of the puzzle. The glowing spheres, the crushed ribs, the radiation on the clothing, and the desperate, panicked flight from the tent. Suddenly, the impossible evidence started to point in one very specific, very dangerous direction. This was the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was in a frantic, secret arms race. They were testing massive nuclear weapons. They were launching classified rockets. They were dropping experimental parachute mines over isolated wilderness areas. Ivanov began to suspect that the 9 hikers had unknowingly walked directly into a classified military testing zone. If a secret Soviet rocket had veered off course, or if a high-altitude weapon had detonated in the sky above the mountain, it would explain everything. A blinding flash of orange light and a deafening explosion would absolutely cause 9 people to cut their way out of a tent in a blind panic. If a weapon produced a massive concussive shockwave, it could easily crush the chests and shatter the skulls of the hikers hiding in the ravine, without ever breaking their skin. It was a terrifying theory, but more importantly, it was a logical one. Ivanov began to draft his reports, hinting at a technological or military cause for the disaster. But in the Soviet Union in 1959, you did not ask questions about secret military tests. Almost immediately, the atmosphere surrounding the investigation completely changed. The local authorities were pushed aside. High-ranking officials arrived from Moscow. They did not come to help Lev Ivanov solve the mystery. They came to shut the investigation down. The orders were clear, absolute, and impossible to argue with. Ivanov was told to stop asking questions about the glowing spheres. He was told to ignore the radiation found on the clothing. He was ordered to close the case. The government wanted the tragedy buried as quickly and quietly as possible. But you cannot easily bury 9 young, popular students from a major university. The city of Sverdlovsk was demanding answers. When the bodies were finally brought back to the city for burial, the tension in the streets was heavy and dark. The authorities tried to convince the families to bury their children quietly, in a small town near the mountains, away from the public eye. But the parents absolutely refused. They demanded a proper funeral in the city. The funerals only added to the horror of the story. Because of the massive trauma and the 3 months spent decaying under the snow, the final bodies were buried in closed zinc coffins. But the families of the first 5 hikers, the ones found on the open slope, were allowed to see their loved ones. What they saw in the open caskets haunted them for the rest of their lives. According to the grieving parents and friends who attended the funeral, the bodies did not look like people who had simply frozen to death. Their skin was an unnatural, deep shade of dark brown or orange. Their hair, which had been dark and youthful just weeks before, was said to have turned entirely gray. Historians and doctors later argued that this was just a natural result of windburn, extreme cold, and the embalming process. But to the terrified families standing in the cemetery, it looked like the government was trying to bury people who had been burned by something unnatural. By the end of May, the funerals were over. The bodies were in the ground. The government wanted the case completely closed. Lev Ivanov was forced to write a final, official conclusion that has frustrated investigators for more than 60 years. He wrote that the cause of death was an unknown compelling force. A compelling natural force. It is a phrase that means absolutely nothing. It is a bureaucratic wall designed to end the conversation. The thick files containing the photographs, the journals, the radiation reports, and the autopsy details were quietly packed away and sent to a secret classified archive. The Soviet government then issued a silent, final order. The entire region surrounding Dead Mountain was strictly forbidden. No hikers, no explorers, and no civilians were allowed to enter the area for the next 3 years. The mountain was locked away. The files were sealed. The investigator was silenced. For decades, the truth about what happened on that freezing slope was buried under the heavy weight of Soviet secrecy. The families were left with nothing but grief and empty government promises. But a mystery this dark cannot stay buried forever. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in the 1990s, the locked doors of the secret archives swung open. The classified files of the Dyatlov Pass Incident were finally released to the public. People thought the files would finally provide the missing answers. They thought the released documents would prove exactly what the military had done. But when researchers actually looked at the pages, they realized the horrifying truth. The files did not solve the mystery. They only proved that even the government did not fully understand what had happened. The official investigation was over, but the era of the theories was just beginning. And some of those theories are far more terrifying than a secret weapon. When the Soviet archives finally opened, the world expected a simple answer. People wanted a hidden document that explained everything. A secret military memo or a classified confession. Instead, they found a void. And human nature hates a void. Without a definitive conclusion, the incident at Dyatlov Pass became a blank canvas for every possible fear. Over the last 60 years, dozens of theories have been presented. Some are grounded in cold, hard science. Some are born from Cold War paranoia. And some cross the line into the supernatural. But every single time a new theory seems to solve the puzzle, one piece of the evidence refuses to fit. The most persistent theory is the one that Lev Ivanov tried to pursue before he was silenced: the secret weapon. During the late 1950s, the Soviet military was actively testing aerial parachute mines. These weapons were dropped from airplanes and designed to detonate in the air, a few feet above the ground. The explosion would create a massive, devastating shock wave without leaving a large crater in the earth. Proponents of this theory argue that a parachute mine drifted off course and detonated over the mountain. A blinding flash of light, and a deafening boom would absolutely cause 9 experienced hikers to slash their way out of a tent in a panic. If they fled down the mountain and hid in the ravine, a second explosion could have created a concussive wave powerful enough to crush their chests and shatter their skulls, all without breaking their skin. This theory perfectly explains the internal injuries. It perfectly explains the glowing orange spheres seen in the sky by other campers, but it fails when you look closely at the physical ground. If a powerful weapon detonated above the ravine, it would have leveled the surrounding trees. It would have left metal shrapnel buried in the snow. It would have melted the ice, but the cedar tree was standing tall. The snow was undisturbed, and there was no debris anywhere on the mountain. Other investigators looked away from the military and looked directly at the mountain itself. They believed the killer was a terrifying, invisible force of nature. There is a rare acoustic phenomenon known as a Kármán vortex street. When high-speed winds blow against a specific shape, like the smooth, dome-like peak of Dead Mountain, it can create miniature tornadoes of air. These swirling winds can produce powerful, low-frequency sound waves, infrasound. Human ears cannot hear infrasound, it is too low, but the human body can feel it. When humans are exposed to infrasound, it vibrates the internal organs. It shakes the fluid inside the eyes, causing blurred vision and hallucinations. But most terrifying of all, it causes a profound, unexplainable sense of absolute dread. The brain registers the vibration as a massive, invisible threat. Imagine sitting in a dark, cramped tent in the middle of a blizzard. Suddenly, your vision blurs. A crushing, overwhelming terror floods your mind. You feel like you are about to die, but you do not know why. You cannot breathe. You have to escape immediately. The infrasound theory perfectly explains the panicked flight. It explains why they slashed the tent instead of untying the door. It explains why they ran into the freezing night without their boots. But it falls apart in the dark ravine. Infrasound cannot shatter a human skull. It cannot break 10 ribs. For a long time, people pointed fingers at the locals. Some believed the hikers were murdered by the indigenous Mansi people for trespassing on sacred land. Others thought they had stumbled across a group of desperate prisoners who had escaped from one of the brutal Soviet labor camps hidden in the northern forests. But the snow held the ultimate alibi. The searchers were absolutely clear. When they found the ruined tent, the snow was perfectly preserved. There were only 9 sets of footprints walking down the slope. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no tracks leading away from the bodies. And the Mansi people actually worked closely with the investigators, helping them navigate the harsh terrain to bring the students home. Murder is a human tragedy, but the evidence proves the hikers were entirely alone. This leads to the most widely accepted scientific explanation. The theory that modern researchers have spent years trying to prove, the slab avalanche. For decades, experts said an avalanche on that slope was impossible. The mountain was simply too flat. But recently, scientists used modern computer simulations to recreate the exact weather conditions of that specific night. They proposed a freak, highly localized event. When the hikers dug into the snow to make a flat space for their tent, they cut into the foundation of the slope. Hours later, the violent winds dumped massive amounts of heavy, dense snow onto the ridge just above them. Eventually, the weight became too much, but it was not a traditional avalanche. A solid, heavy block of hard ice simply snapped. It slid down a few feet, silently and heavily, landing directly on top of the canvas tent. Being crushed under a solid block of ice would explain the broken ribs. It would explain why they had to cut their way out of the side of the tent. It would explain why they left their gear buried under the heavy snow. Science also explains why they were found without their clothes. It is a well-documented medical phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. When a human body reaches the final, fatal stages of hypothermia, the nerves fail. The blood vessels suddenly dilate, rushing warm blood to the freezing skin. The person suddenly feels like they are burning alive. In their final moments of delirium, they rip off their clothes in the snow. The avalanche theory combined with paradoxical undressing seems to wrap the mystery in a neat, scientific package. But even with the best computer models in the world, the story still refuses to make perfect sense. If an ice block crushed Semyon and Ludmila inside the tent, how did they walk a mile and a half down the mountain with shattered ribs? Medical experts say it is physically impossible to walk that far with a bleeding heart and a crushed chest. If they were crushed in the ravine, how did an avalanche reach them inside a dense forest, surrounded by tall, untouched trees? And then, there is the detail that the scientific models simply ignore. The radiation. Why were their clothes emitting high levels of beta radiation? Some researchers brush it off, saying the students might have worked with radioactive materials back at the institute. Some say the camping lanterns used thorium mantles that slightly contaminated their gloves, but those explanations feel hollow. They feel like desperate attempts to explain away a deeply terrifying piece of evidence. Every theory solves one problem, only to create another. The closer you look at the events of February 2nd, 1959, the more the facts seem to shift and change in the dark. It is like looking at a shadow in the corner of your room. The longer you stare, the less you understand what you are seeing. And perhaps that is exactly why the story of the 9 hikers refuses to fade away. When you strip away the complex scientific models, and you push aside the massive government conspiracies, you are left with the silence of the mountain. And in that silence, there are small, quiet details that simply refuse to fade away. These are the anomalies. The pieces of evidence that do not fit into any theory. The strange, lingering facts that keep researchers awake at night, staring at old black and white photographs. If an avalanche crushed the tent, or if a secret weapon drove them into the freezing night in a state of absolute, blind panic, the physical evidence should reflect chaos. But the more you look at the crime scene, the more you realize that the hikers were not acting irrationally. They were trying to survive. Consider the flashlight. When the search party finally found the ruined tent on the slope of Dead Mountain, they found a small, metal flashlight resting right on top of the torn canvas. It was not buried deep in the snow. It was not tossed aside in the frantic rush to escape. It had been placed there intentionally. The switch was turned to the on position. The battery had died long before the searchers arrived, but it had clearly been left shining in the dark. If a massive slab of ice had violently crushed the tent, that flashlight would have been swept away or buried under hundreds of pounds of snow. But it was sitting neatly on the surface. And more importantly, placing a flashlight on the roof of a tent is not the action of someone fleeing in mindless terror. It is a deeply calculated move. It is a beacon. Someone in the group turned on the light and left it on the highest point of the collapsed tent so they could find their way back. They knew they were stepping into the pitch black of a winter blizzard. They knew they would become disoriented. They fully intended to return once whatever danger they were fleeing had passed. They were not running to die. They were retreating. Then there is the strange piece of fabric. While carefully digging through the snow around the campsite, the civilian investigators found a scrap of dark, heavy material. It was identified as a piece of an obmaki. That is a thick, military-style cloth wrapping worn around the lower legs to keep snow out of a soldier's boots. The problem is that none of the 9 hikers wore obmaki. It was not part of their gear. It was not listed on any of their packing manifests. So where did it come from? Who dropped a piece of military clothing near the tent on the most isolated, dangerous mountain in the northern Urals? Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator, noted the mysterious fabric in his early reports. But when the government officials arrived from Moscow to shut the investigation down, the piece of cloth was quietly ignored. It was never explained. It simply vanished into the classified archives, leaving behind the terrifying implication that the 9 hikers might not have been alone on the mountain. But perhaps the most unsettling pieces of evidence are the ones the hikers left themselves. The group carried several cameras. They meticulously documented their journey. For weeks after the bodies were found, police technicians sat in dark rooms in the city, slowly developing the rolls of film recovered from the freezing snow. It must have been a haunting experience for the technicians. Watching the smiling faces of dead men and women slowly appear in the chemical baths, frame after frame of laughter, snowball fights, and deep friendships. But the very last photograph taken on one of the cameras is different. It is known among researchers as frame number 34. It does not show a smiling face, it does not show a snowy landscape, it is entirely dark, except for a bright, blurry, glowing shape in the center. It looks like a massive orb of light, moving violently against a black background. Skeptics argue that the photograph is just a mistake. A light leak caused when the technician unloaded the damaged camera in the darkroom, or a blurry picture of the campfire taken completely by accident. But others look at frame 34 and feel a deep sense of dread. They wonder if the camera was grabbed in the chaotic final moments inside the tent. They wonder if that blurry, glowing orb is a photograph of exactly what drove them out into the freezing night. The glowing spheres in the sky. The unknown compelling force. We will never know. Because the one man who tried to tell us what happened was silenced by the mountain. Semyon Zolotaryov was 38 years old. He had fought through the most brutal, devastating battles of the Second World War. He had looked death in the face countless times and survived. When Semyon fled the tent, he was wearing a camera around his neck. It was a secondary camera, one that was not listed on the official expedition gear list. He kept it hidden under his coat. When he was found dead in the freezing creek 3 months later, the camera was still wrapped around his neck. The water had completely destroyed the film. We will never know what Semyon felt was so important that he grabbed a camera instead of his boots. But he grabbed something else too. When the searchers pulled his badly decomposed body from the freezing mud of the ravine, they found his hands clenched tight. Semyon was holding a small piece of paper and a pen. Down in the pitch black of the forest, hiding in a shallow snow cave, Semyon knew he was not going to make it. His ribs were shattered, his friends were dead or dying, the cold was consuming him, but the hardened soldier did not panic. In his final, agonizing moments of life, he reached into his pocket, he pulled out his notepad and his pen, he tried to write something down. He tried to leave a message for whoever found his body. He tried to explain the horror of what had just happened, but he died before he could finish. And his body fell forward into the running meltwater of the creek. For 3 long months, the freezing water flowed steadily over his hands. The water washed away the soft tissue of his face, and it washed away the ink on the fragile piece of paper. When the investigators finally pried the notepad from his frozen fingers, the page was completely blank. Whatever Semyon saw, whatever truth he desperately wanted the world to know, was erased by the mountain. The secret died with him in the dark. The mystery of Dyatlov Pass is not just a puzzle about missing boots and slashed canvas. It is a story about the fragile line between life and death. It is about 9 people who fought with absolutely everything they had against an unstoppable force. And the true horror of the story is not how they died. The true horror is what the world did to their memory after the snow finally melted. It has been more than 60 years since the snow settled over the footprints on Dead Mountain. In the decades since that freezing February night, the Dyatlov Pass Incident has become one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in human history. It has inspired countless books, documentaries, massive internet forums, and late-night debates. Millions of people who will never set foot in the freezing cold of the Russian wilderness know the names of the 9 hikers. But why are we still so obsessed with it? We are obsessed because human beings have a desperate, fundamental need for the world to make sense. When something terrible happens, we want a clear villain, we want a responsible party. If it was a secret military weapon, we can blame a reckless government. If it was a freak slab avalanche, we can blame the unpredictable cruelty of nature. If it was a hostile encounter, we can blame the darkness of the human heart. We can accept tragedy, but we cannot accept the unknown. The incident at Dyatlov Pass terrifies us because it refuses to fit into a logical box. It sits exactly on the borderline between a natural disaster and a terrifying nightmare. Every time we think we have the answer, a missing tongue, a radioactive sweater, or a slashed tent pulls us back into the dark. It reminds us that there are still places in this world where human logic simply does not matter. But in our obsession with the mystery, it is incredibly easy to forget the mandate of the tragedy. It is easy to get lost in the autopsy files and the radiation reports, and forget that these were 9 real people. They were not characters in a horror story. They were young. They were brilliant. They were sons and daughters, brothers and sisters. They loved poetry. They loved science. They loved the quiet beauty of the winter woods. They did not go to the mountain to become a mystery. They went because they loved being alive. Perhaps no one understood that painful reality better than Yuri Yudin. Yuri was the 10th hiker, the one who turned back at the logging settlement because of a severe pain in his back. He was the young man who stood in the freezing morning air, hugging his friends goodbye, completely unaware that he was looking at them for the very last time. Yuri lived a long, full life. He became a respected professional. He grew old, but the mountain never really let him go. For the rest of his life, Yuri was tormented by a quiet, devastating survivor's guilt. He spent decades giving interviews, helping investigators, and trying to find the truth about what happened to his friends. He wanted to know why fate had chosen to spare him and condemn them to the ice. He never found the answer. When Yuri Yudin passed away in 2013 at the age of 75, he had one final request. He did not want to be buried in a lonely cemetery. His final wish was to be taken to the city of Sverdlovsk, to the exact same cemetery where the victims of the expedition were laid to rest. More than 50 years after he watched them sky away into the forest, Yuri finally rejoined his group. Today, the mountain where they died is no longer just a nameless ridge on the map. It is officially known as Dyatlov Pass, named in permanent honor of the 23-year-old leader who tried so desperately to keep his friends alive in the dark. If you travel to the pass today, you will find a large metal memorial bolted to a massive jagged rock. The monument sits alone on the barren slope, constantly battered by the howling winds. Carved into the metal are the faces of the 9 hikers. They are looking out over the desolate, frozen valley, forever watching the place where their journey ended. People still visit the pass. Modern hikers and extreme adventurers travel to the northern Urals to stand where the tent was pitched. They take photographs. They leave flowers at the memorial. But the mountain has not changed. The environment is just as hostile, just as unpredictable, and just as deadly as it was in 1959. The weather can still turn from a calm winter afternoon into a blinding, screaming whiteout in a matter of minutes. The local indigenous people still treat the deep wilderness with a profound, quiet respect. They know that the mountain does not care about our theories. It does not care about our investigations. It is simply there, cold, silent, and entirely indifferent to human life. We will probably never know exactly what happened on the night of February 2nd. The classified government files have all been read. The scientific computer models have all been run. The bodies have long since returned to the earth. There is no new evidence waiting to be discovered under the snow. The truth is permanently locked away in the ice of the past. What we are left with is a single, haunting image that will never fade away. Imagine you are standing on the open slope of Dead Mountain. It is the middle of the night. The temperature is -20 degrees. The wind is screaming in your ears, and right there, half buried in the drifting snow, is a ruined canvas tent. The fabric has been slashed violently from the inside. Inside the tent, it is completely quiet. There are warm coats. There are heavy boots. There are pieces of sliced meat waiting to be eaten. There is a handwritten newspaper filled with inside jokes, left sitting in the dark, and leading away from the tent, walking down into the absolute blackness of the freezing valley, are 9 sets of bare footprints, moving together, walking calmly toward a horror that the world will never truly understand. The wind blows across the ridge, shifting the snow, and slowly covering the tracks forever. If you are still listening, I want to thank you for spending this time with me in the dark. Stories like the one from Dead Mountain remind us how fragile we really are when we step away from the warmth of modern civilization. What do you think happened to those 9 hikers? Was it a freak act of nature that science is still trying to decode? Or did they stumble into something the world was never meant to see? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you found this journey deeply unsettling and you want to explore more true historical mysteries and dark stories told like this, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support ensures that these memories are never truly forgotten. Until next time, keep looking into the dark, but stay safe out there. Good night.